and adolescents with autism spectrum disorder. So I am a provisional psychologist, but actually most of my work with individuals with autism hasn't been in that capacity. I've recently completed my master's in clinical psychology, and that has sort of led, I came to that position because I thought I really want to understand more about autism spectrum disorder and understand how people diagnose it, and what sort of interventions are there to support them in building skills and meeting their goals, their life goals. So that's why I went and did my master's. I just finished it about a month ago, and so I'm really excited about that. And I was able to have, thank you, I was able to do my research project looking at outcomes in children with autism spectrum disorder. I'm actually going to call it ASD from here on, because otherwise I'm going to get a bit tongue-tied saying that and repeating it. So my research, I would have children come into our centre and I would assess them, basically a diagnostic assessment. I was taught how to understand what the indicators of autism are, knowing that they vary in every individual, and how to come to some sort of conclusion whether that meets a clinical diagnosis. A clinical diagnosis just means, is it interfering with their everyday functioning? And is it causing them significant distress or impairment? So I was having a conversation before with a mentor just as he arrived, and he was talking about how autism spectrum disorder is a spectrum, and the types of characteristics and traits we see in this condition are traits that we all have to certain degrees. So we all experience difficulties in the social environment. We all have behaviours that we might do repetitively when we're anxious. It's more, whether this is something that it began early on in a child's life, in their early years, and how much that is affecting them. So that's why it's called autism spectrum disorder. It's sort of, the spectrum communicates that it happens to a varying degree. If anyone has any questions, I'm going to just go through a bit about what further is autism spectrum disorder. And then after I play a video, if there's any other questions that you might have, just raise your hand and we can talk about them.
Will there be notes on what you're doing tonight?
There will be notes. Natalie is going to upload them to
our website, just to the mentoring support hub, so that the PowerPoint slides and the recording of this as well, okay?
Yeah.
So you don't have to take any notes.
Thank you.
I also just realised, I was talking about my research and my master's before, but actually I was talking about how most of my experience actually doesn't come from being a psychologist. For about 6 years I've been a disability support worker. Has anyone done disability support in the room? So there's one person here, a few more. So it's quite common. It just means that you work in someone's home or take them out into the community for an individual who has a disability. So I'm primarily worked with children and adolescents with ASD. So most of my knowledge tonight is going to come from my experiences as a support worker, working in home with their families, and as well as a little bit in DHS as well. There were some children in DHS that had ASD as well that I worked with. I'm going to play this video now, or ask Paul to. Thank you, Paul. Paul is helping us with tech tonight very, very kindly. I appreciate it.
Conventions that others take for granted. They might have trouble making eye contact, holding a conversation, or recognizing gestures. And over 1/3 of people with ASD are nonverbal, meaning they don't use speech. Along with communication issues, people with autism often like to follow certain patterns or repeated behaviors. Many have a sensitivity to bright light or loud noises, and others have physical problems like trouble walking or picking up small objects. Some have intellectual disabilities, but about half have average or above average IQs. It's also common for people with autism to have a great long-term memory for certain details, and many excel in math, science, music, or art. With such a wide variety of symptoms, no two people with ASD are alike. The behaviors vary so much that they used to be classified as different disorders. One was Asperger's syndrome, where people obsess over particular topics, miss nonverbal social cues, and may not understand appropriate social behavior. In 2013, scientists realized that the boundary between Asperger's syndrome and some of the other disorders was fuzzy, so they decided to put them all under one name. This made it easier to diagnose autism, which is important. The younger someone is diagnosed, the earlier they can get help. In fact, many children who have autism will show signs by just 2 years old, including not responding to their name, avoiding eye contact, and flapping their hands or rocking repeatedly. Even though there is no cure for ASD, therapy and medication can help people adjust. Scientists are also doing clinical trials to find other solutions. They've learned that 1 out of every 68 children in the US has the disorder, but they still aren't sure what causes it. Autism is over 4 times more common in boys than girls, and most scientists think genes play a role because it often runs in families. Some people with ASD have abnormal chromosomes, but this can't be the whole story. There are people with the same gene changes who don't have autism. Other possible causes include having older parents, being exposed to high levels of testosterone in the womb, and having complications during pregnancy or birth. It may even have something to do with gut bacteria, since many autistic people have gastrointestinal issues. But most likely, it's a combination of many factors. The one thing scientists know for sure is that vaccines do not cause autism. No matter why it happens, ASD is being diagnosed at a higher rate every year. This doesn't mean it's becoming more common. It just means more people are aware of the condition and getting diagnosed early. And awareness is crucial. The more we learn about autism, the more we can understand and relate to those who have it. It's important to note that people with ASD deserve the same respect, fairness, and chances that people without ASD receive. This will help people with ASD adapt and grow in our communities. We put some resources in the description if you would like to learn more about ASD and figure out.
I thought that is quite a good summary of some questions that you may have already had, like how common is it? Why does it appear to be increasing in prevalence? A lot of people have asked me in the past. I think the current stat for Australia is 1 in 49 children are being diagnosed. Those are children under the age of 7 at the moment. So, 20 years ago, we didn't have, it probably would have been 1 in 1,000 people were being diagnosed, and people just recognised it in its most severe form. Usually when someone couldn't speak verbally, it was recognised. So it's good nowadays that we're able to understand the more subtle forms of autism, so that people can get more support from an earlier age. So you probably gained from that video that there's 2 main clusters of autism traits. The first one is social communication and interaction impairments. What does that mean? Social communication, I'm going to start with that. So social communication is not just the verbal cues that I'm using now, but also the non-verbal ones to communicate a message to everyone here. So I'm using my hands, gestures, I'm using eye contact, I'm scanning the room, I'm trying to use socially appropriate language, and most importantly, I'm integrating them together. So I'm using them at the same time. Most people with autism can make eye contact, and often really well, start a conversation, engage in a conversation, but it's how they integrate and use them at the same time to send a message to the other person that's clear. Sometimes they might struggle to be clear because they might not be using eye contact when they're speaking, because it's hard for them to use them all at the same time. The interaction part, so what I mean by that is the actually connecting with someone in a mutual way. So if it was, you often notice that someone with ASD might initiate conversations that are more about in line with what they feel comfortable talking about, and that's usually that they have a really strong interest in something. So I was hearing someone overheard someone before talking about a boy that they know who loves superheroes. So they'll come up to you and want to talk to you all about superheroes, but then that interaction part, the impairment in interaction might become noticeable when you say to them, oh, that's really cool, John. Did you know on the weekend I went to the superhero festival? John might go back and say, oh, I really like Batman. And there wasn't that acknowledgement there of, oh, Felicity, you went to the festival? How was that? You know, so that's the reciprocal nature they might struggle with more so than typically developing children. Does anyone have any questions? I'm going to go into that a bit more detail on the next slide, but just off the top of your head. I feel like some people in this room already have quite a bit of an expertise in autism. So I was talking to a few people who have family members that have been diagnosed with ASD, or maybe they haven't been, but you can sort of see that they might be higher on those traits than the average person. I'd really like, if you have a great example tonight of something that you've experienced with a family member or a mentee that you're mentoring, please pipe in, and I'd love to hear that, just because I know that my knowledge just really comes from being a support worker. And although I've been in the home, I haven't been there all day, every day, or I haven't been in a really emotional relationship with someone with autism. So it would be great to hear those examples as well. The second one, the second cluster is impairment in behaviour. And by that I mean that their behaviour can be at times repetitive, and so you might see a child spinning around in circles. I have one boy that sort of likes to walk on his heels, and we call them repetitive because they're not always there, they just come out at certain times. And you might question, well, why do they engage in that repetitive behaviour? It's usually because something's making them feel uncomfortable, or they're feeling anxious, uncertain about something, and so it's just a natural manifestation for them to help them regulate their own emotions. I'm going to go into them a bit more in detail. So before I was talking about social interaction, and we're talking about how there's impairments in that reciprocity in the relationship. And it can mean for the child that they can feel quite anxious in a social situation because they know that people are expecting them to behave a certain way, but they naturally they're trying to understand why people might be giving them a weird look, or they might not be responding as well to something that they've said. So, why is this person staring at me like this? And, it might be because they're wanting the child to say something back to them. And so it can be sometimes a bit of an unknown world going into a new social interaction for a child with autism. The one I mentioned already before was impairment in non-verbal communicative behaviours. So even things like pointing or using one that's included there is your pitch as well. So usually when to send a clear message to someone, when we're communicating, we'll vary our pitch, and we can detect emotion through pitch. Individuals with ASD will have abnormalities in their pitch, so they might be quite exaggerated or maybe flat, and that can sometimes make it difficult for the reciprocant to understand completely what they're trying to communicate. And yeah, they might just sometimes miss something that's going on non-verbally for the person that they're talking to. So when they're experiencing impairments in these non-verbal cues, it's not just them using them, but also seeing them in other people. So I may have subtly changed my facial expression, but because they're not integrating eye contact quickly enough, they might miss that change and then not wonder why I've walked off to do something. And so there can be sometimes misinterpretation for that individual, and that can be anxiety provoking for them. And just the last one, deficits in developing, maintaining and understanding relationships. This is probably the thing that people notice most when they're thinking, I wonder if that child might have autism. And we're going to come to a few myths later on about some people think, well, is it that the child doesn't want to make friends? And I'm hoping that you're gaining an understanding here of that. It's not that they don't want to understand and maintain a relationship, it's just that they're having difficulties with the non-verbal and verbal cues and understanding them. And it's a skill. It's one of the areas of social emotional intelligence that we all have varying degrees of, and theirs tends to be more impaired. And so it might appear that they don't want to talk to the person, but it might just be too anxiety provoking because they're having trouble understanding what's going on for that other person, or what just to say. It can mean that sometimes in relationships they can get frustrated because they might think that they've clearly communicated something to you, but you may not have understood, and they can feel quite lonely at times. There's high rates of depression in children and adults with autism spectrum disorder, more so than the general population. Same with high levels of anxiety. And just because sometimes they can feel misunderstood because it's not widely understood. Does anyone have any questions about impairments in social interaction and communication? Up the back there.
Is there an underlying consistent high level of anxiety, or is anxiety more triggered by a situation, event?
That's a really good question. So the way I see anxiety, and a psychologist usually does, is in a bidirectional way. Anxiety feeds in to the social situation feeds into anxiety. By that I mean there's lots of different things that are contributing to them feeling anxious. And I would say on a daily basis, most children and adults with autism experience a naturally high level of anxiety than the average person. And I view myself that as a consequence of the difficulties they have with social interaction and understanding social cues and communicating clearly. But also a lot of individuals with autism have sensory difficulties, and we're going to come to that soon. They can be quite hypersensitive to touch, noise, any of the 5 senses, and that can be very anxiety provoking. So, but then when you're feeling anxious because half an hour ago your little brother came and screamed in your face, when you're already feeling anxious from that, then your social performance goes down. So when you're already feeling anxious, you're not able to concentrate as much on gaining information from your environment. So it's really, they both feed into it, but I wouldn't say that autism is anxiety. A lot of people have said that to me. Autism is just anxiety, and everything comes out of the anxiety. What research is showing, it's really the two main things are impairments in social interaction and communication, and then the repetitive behaviour. Does that answer your question? Yeah.
So what, like I was just thinking about something slightly different. Introverts that live in an extrovert world, sometimes at great expense to themselves, they can play a role that enables them to cope in an extrovert world, but they then may retreat to recover from that role that they might have played. I'm just wondering, as a child with ASD, as they grow, can they develop skills to cope in a largely non-ASD world in terms of develop social skills and overcome or become aware of their social situation?
Yes.
That's the question.
No, I don't have all, I know you'd understand I don't have all the answers.
And I'm loving the presentation so far.
Thank
so
you.
it's going.
When I mean all the answers, my this is sort of mine is from my experience and from my training in psychology. So where I'm unsure, I'll just state it. But what I have learnt is that they will always struggle more than the average person socially and with repetitive behaviour and anxiety. And those challenges will exist. But definitely they can, through intervention, mentoring, having a support worker, having really involved parents, develop social skills. So sometimes if you've spoken to a teenager or an adult that's had a lot of intervention and support, you might not realise that they have autism at all in a conversation because they have practiced so much and learnt about the different ways that, the different social cues to use to help people hear what they're trying to say and to just adapt to those situations. And it might only become obvious that they have ASD until, half an hour into the conversation, something might get a bit clunky and they may not have come across what you're talking about before. And then usually when the situation's unknown, they might stop the conversation suddenly or just deflect the conversation to one of their strong interests, and then you think, oh, well, we just went on a tangent there, but you might not necessarily pick it because they've learnt a lot of new skills. And as psychologists, we see someone's intelligence or abilities as multiple, varying, many different types of abilities, and if someone can, each ability can receive intervention, and you can learn how to improve these skills. And specifically in autism, it's in the area of social and emotional intelligence. Yeah. Is that helpful? Yeah.
I'm just going to add to that, having grandsons got autism. The earlier you can get to them, the better.
Yep.
I
Yeah.
know what you're saying. The earlier you can get to them, the easier it is for them to understand as they grow up that they have the problem, and then they can, as you say, learn to divert, change.
Yeah, because there's all that neuroplasticity early on that you learn skills so much easier as a young person up the back.
How difficult then is it for a person who has never been diagnosed with autism going into adult life? If I'm thinking of a particular individual who struggled from childhood right through, but a parent not, or really not willing to accept a diagnosis autism. Is that prevalent?
Mm. Yeah, it is quite prevalent. I have to do a series of placements in my clinical psychology training, and one was at a community health centre. I saw some adults that I thought met criteria for an ASD diagnosis, and I think, yeah, I suppose it depends on who you're talking about, whether people in situations I've seen is really where the person's being misunderstood, like they're struggling to hold down employment, if get employment, and in that situation, because the person doesn't have a diagnosis, people aren't providing them with understanding and support, and then that person hasn't even contemplated that might be there might be something there that such as ASD. So in my experience, it's really if they are going in for counselling for something like anxiety or depression associated with difficulties in finding employment and making friends, then if they went to see a psychologist, after some sessions getting to know the person, they would be able to disentangle and hypothesise that, oh, there's something more going on here. And they would only go down the diagnostic track if they thought it was to be helpful for the person. You can provide someone support without giving them a diagnosis, and how you have that conversation with the adult would be according to what you thought was best for them. If they were interested in just learning more about themselves, then you would go further down. But with that gentleman that I'm thinking of, we just talked about the things that he really struggled with, and what we could work on together. So usually it's when they turn up to the counselling room because they're really depressed or anxious. If it's interfering with their everyday life, some people have ASD traits, but they get through fine. Yeah.
I mean, I too, like Rob, have a grandson, a 10-year-old grandson with autism, spectrum disorder, and Mitchell is learning these techniques to be able to, in certain situations, how he can actually respond differently to what he would normally do.
Yeah.
Like you say, the slightest touch or whatever, he's given away playing basketball, for instance, because he had to be touch someone else playing basketball. He just sent him right off the ball with us. And he became very frustrated with himself, not letting the other team and everything else as well. But it seems to me that one of the issues that's a frustration that's been for my son and daughter-in-law in raising the children is the level of ignorance, if I can use that term in a kind word, way for people in society, and particularly in schools, even in schools, to actually acknowledge that this little boy is actually working flat out to try and keep himself under control here, while this other kid over here who's just a bully is actually needling it, and he's getting involved with it. So there's, I'm sort of encouraged a bit by this show that's just come on recently, The Good Doctor. It's coming on, and thinking about the positives that can come out of something like that, where it actually becomes more of a something that people watch and see and can actually recognise as something different about this guy. Super intelligent, but has many of these characteristics that say here, and how do people respond to it. It's really interesting.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I think it's going to be one of those things that's, in a way, it's almost more recently diagnosed type of illness or condition that children or people have. It's becoming perhaps more commonly known about. The more that happens, the better we can actually help as a society to work with children in particular that adults as well.
Yeah, well, over the last 10 years, mental health in general and developmental disorders have received so much more attention in the media, and now they're educating children in schools about it, and they're trying to incorporate that into teachers' education too. Hopefully it'll just increase, and because your grandson needs the most important people around him, his teacher, to understand what it's...
And some do, and some just
Yeah.
don't keep, it hasn't registered properly.
And I like that you bring up the example of basketball, because there's sometimes there can be this unhelpful desire in us to want to try and make a child with ASD normal. And so he's got to play basketball because he's really good at it, and I know he would enjoy it. So we're just going to push him to play basketball. And really what researchers and psychologists have found is really doing a cost-benefit analysis for the child. How do we get them to make sure that they have all the essential everyday life skills, like can they exercise and get fresh air and be healthy and have some meaningful relationships in their life. They don't have to have a million friends, but some key ones that are going to be supportive for them, rather than being set on making sure they have every great experience that we think would be good for them. So it's really focusing on those essential skills, like, exercise is so important, but if at the moment you've really tried with basketball and it's not going well, then finding some other form of exercise that he might take too. Because I know I've got one boy that I support in disability work, and he's just not going outside. He's so pale, he's not going outside. And so we've had to try and put rewards in place for taking his dog for a walk. So now we walk to the fish and chip shop and we get minimum chips. And I've just been trying to educate him on what exercise does to you, or what happens if you don't exercise when you get older. Because kids with autism, one of the strengths of autism is they're very logical. So they want to understand things and they want you to explain it to them. But if you explain the reason quite clearly to them, and just not say, it's good for you, but explain why it's good for you, then they're much more likely to push themselves a bit more out of their comfort zone. I'm just aware of the time. I'm going to keep moving on, but this is really helpful because that was a great example before. So thank you for sharing. And we talked a bit about how it affects behaviour and interests before. I think what I'll just highlight here is that one of the key features of autism is psychological inflexibility. So they really hang on to their routines, and they insist upon things being done in a certain sequence, or say when they're brushing their teeth, they'll do it in the same way every time, or when they're making their breakfast, and they might experience some or a lot of distress if that routine is interfered with. So and that for them is, we don't quite understand repetitive behaviour. Research hasn't really illuminated it very well for us, but the main theory at the moment is because of the social anxiety they experience and the sensory difficulties they experience. One way to control that chaos in their social world is by trying to control the things that they can control, and it minimises the chaos for them and helps them to emotionally regulate. And what I mean by that is to soothe themselves when they don't understand something, or they're finding something just difficult to do at school. They might start, tapping their foot because it's something to help them focus or to keep them calm. So these are just some examples of sensory processing difficulties. Not every child has sensory issues who has autism. So just like not every child has an intellectual disability either. But it is one, probably most children with autism do, and they might predominantly be hypersensitive, so certain sounds, or they might not like certain clothes on their skin, certain fabrics might cause them elevated anxiety, or they might be predominantly hyposensitive. By that I mean they don't have they're understimulated, so they're always looking for things to kind of touch or hear. They might play their music really loudly. Most children with autism spectrum disorder actually oscillate between these. So they actually find it hard to find an equilibrium, a medium point, so they can, grab their iPad, and be fixated on it for ages and trying to become stimulated, but then the little brother might run in the room and is way too loud, and then suddenly they're overwhelmed. So it usually oscillates between both. I'm just going to, actually, what's the time? I might skip this video actually, because I might not have enough time for it. Someone once told me this analogy and I really like it. Comparing autism to neurotypicals is like comparing trains to cars. I'll explain why. So, cars, that's people, whoa, fluff thing fell off. People with, people who are not diagnosed with ASD, I'm not sure if anyone in the room here is today, but so I'll call myself a car. I haven't been diagnosed with ASD. I tend to be all right with changing lanes when cars are kind of diverting in front of me. I might get a bit annoyed and occasionally swear, which I try not to do, but I put on my brakes, take a deep breath, and just keep going. I love taking new routes. Not everyone likes this, but I like finding new routes to places. I find it really fun and interesting. It annoys my sister. She wants to go the same way every time. I can go around obstacles. So, if there's an obstacle, I'll swerve. I'm over-explaining this. Trains. So, the individual with ASD, they like to stay on the train tracks. They like to only go one route, and obstacles better stay out of the way of a train. So if you try and stop them from engaging in their repetitive behaviour, it is likely that you'll be met with significant distress, or but then you're contemplating. You might be trying to get out the door for school, and they're doing something repetitive, and you really need to get going, and you think it's really important. But at the end of the day, if they become really distressed, you're not going to be able to get out of the door anyway. So you've got a dilemma there. So usually with someone with ASD, we figure out a way, if it's really important for us to get somewhere on time, that we can either move that activity into the car, or we can forewarn them that change is going to happen. So do we give them maybe a 10-minute warning that that's what's going to happen, so they can start preparing themselves for that? So trains operate differently to cars. However, if you let them stay on their tracks, they'll eventually arrive at their destination. So this is to answer someone's question in the middle earlier on. Can they still, set goals and social goals to be a school captain or have a babysitting job or anything that requires social skills? If they have an awareness of the most fundamental things needed for that position, and it's just social skills that are holding them back, we need to support them in their route to becoming what they want to be. not how we would go about it. One of my clients in disability support, he is school captain now. Yes, he is at a special development school, but he's school captain now, and I went along to his awards night, and he gave a speech and everything, and he remembered that I was talking to him about, you know, eye contact and making sure you look at everyone, and he did all of those things really well, and he enjoyed the experience. So I was really, it was a real privilege to see him do that. Just thinking where we might take a break soon. I might just flick quickly through the next few slides, and then we'll have a quick bathroom and coffee tea break, and then we'll get back to it. So yeah, we've talked a lot about impairment today. Like with any of us, if there's obstacles to our goals in life, we need to identify our strengths to help us to get there, to meet that goal. So that's why it's really important to look at what's the strength of someone with autism spectrum disorder. Most of them have a really good rote memory. We don't know why, but it's there. I know a boy with an intellectual disability who has autism as well. His intellectual capacity is about 2 years of age, but he's 18 years old, and I've known him for some time now. He can remember, you know, the words of at least 300 songs. He's just constantly singing new songs, and he has the IQ, or what we would call in psychology the IQ of probably a 2 to 3 year old. And I just think it's incredibly amazing. I have so much fun with him. And he actually is one of the clients that I was able to build quite a strong relationship with, and an emotional relationship with, because we both shared that common interest of music, and we would sing a lot together, and he would have so much fun and I would have so much fun. Yeah, and they've got good attention to detail, very logical, as we were talking about, super honest. You always know what you're going to get. And quirky sense of humour. That you really, to mentor or to support someone with autism, you got to not take yourself too seriously, but just to be able to laugh at the witty, the silly, because you're not, they don't take themselves seriously, so why should we? And just have fun, you know? And they're very focused. It's very difficult to interrupt them when they're into a task, and it means that they'll do the task very well. And a visual processor. So there's a great video, I'm not going to play it today, but it's by this lady called Temple Grandin, and she's quite famous in the media. She has ASD herself, and she's done a lot of conferences for people. And she has a great video on how individual with ASD sees the world much more visually and less in words, and they don't get as much information from the environment through listening. It's really through just viewing what's going on around them, which is why support workers such as myself will use often pictures when I'm communicating, or my schedule will have pictures rather than words. So a lot of jobs need great visual processors, so a lot of people with ASD work in visual jobs. Well, jobs that require strong visual skills. I'm going to pause there because we're on to the mentoring session,